Welcome to all of you. My name is Sarah Biddulph and I am the Director of the Asian Law Centres, and I'm really pleased to welcome you today to the Asian Law Centre seminar series celebrating Asian legal careers. First, I'd like to acknowledge country, that we are sitting today, or I am sitting today, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I pay my respects to the original owners of the country wherever you are listening to this recording. So I'd like to welcome Natasha Kassam. Natasha, we're delighted that you're able to join us today and to tell us something of your own story. Let me introduce Natasha to you. Natasha Kassam is Director of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program, directing the annual Lowy Institute poll and researching China's politics, Taiwan and Australia-China relations. She has been a fellow of the ANU Security College's Futures Council for 2020-21, and she's a member of the Advisory Board of the University of Melbourne's Asian Law Centre. So Natasha, of course, is indeed a very valued member of our advisory board, and we've welcomed your inputs and support during your tenure. Prior to joining the Lowy Institute, Natasha was an Australian diplomat in China and the Solomon Islands. She was part of the drafting team for the Australian government's 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. She holds a Bachelor of Laws honours and a Bachelor of International Studies from the University of Sydney and speaks Mandarin. She will soon take up a position as a foreign policy advisor in the Foreign Minister's Office. Natasha, welcome, and might I invite you now to tell us something about your career path and the opportunities and challenges that you have faced along the way.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be here today and would also like to acknowledge this land that I stand on here today in Sydney. We're very lucky to be able to have this conversation, even though we're very far apart. So I won't repeat your beautiful acknowledgement, but I wanted to acknowledge the country that we're on here as well. Now, I always think about my career in terms of opportunities and challenges, really, because none of it has ever been very clear. You know, I'm really very lucky to have had the wonderful positions that I've held in the places I've been, but none of it was a plan. None of it really was something that I was lined up to do, and I decided what I was aiming for from the very beginning. Even when I went to study law, you know, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to travel the world and learn about different people and different cultures and write about it. And my very excellent, hardworking immigrant parents were like, maybe not just a journalism degree, or maybe not just an international studies degree. Why don't you just throw some law in there as well, just as a backup? Of course, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the way my mind worked and the way that I loved to be focused on evidence and data and, pulling together all these different data points to build an argument is basically who I've been since I was a child. And so I went to study law and international studies at Sydney University, and I really loved it, but maybe not in the way that a lot of my colleagues did. You know, I was really interested in the social justice element and the way in which the law had empowered particular communities and had disenfranchised other communities. Was really interested in, the way in which the law could be applied in all these different situations and could lead to very different results. And then when I started to look internationally, I saw that even more. And it really led me to pursue this particular career that is, we might say law adjacent, but has had that, I think, at the center all through it. So when I graduated from university, I applied for government jobs, honestly, because there was a global financial crisis. It was basically impossible to get a job anywhere. I didn't want to study anymore. I really wanted to practice. I had done a year at a law firm as a paralegal, one of the big 4 law firms in Sydney, and had really found it did not suit me. Not because, they weren't doing interesting work or they weren't great people, but because I was really passionate about the human rights, the social justice, that side of things. And it just wasn't even a factor in the thinking in the corporate law world. If I can be honest with the students today, I think that I just did it because everybody else was doing it. It was fourth year uni. You're supposed to be a paralegal, then you're supposed to go do a clerkship at a big law firm. And that summer approached, and the idea of spending the entire summer at a law firm doing corporate law, I was like, wait, what has happened? I was meant to be a journalist. I was meant to be a correspondent. I was meant to do things very differently. So I walked away from the corporate law world. I spent that summer traveling around Southeast Asia and learned so much about myself, but also about, where I wanted to be in terms of what was important to me. And then again, it's just luck, really. I mean, hard work and luck, but that when the financial crisis hit and basically no newsrooms were hiring, so journalism wasn't an option, no law firms were hiring either, if I was going to consider that again. But the government still was. And I applied to every government department that you've never heard of, literally every single one, to arts, to communications, to environment, to agriculture. I really just wanted to work, and I wanted to work in a practical policy space. I guess they all saw straight through me that I really didn't know what I was doing, and they all rejected me, except for the Attorney General's Department and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And that was, again, what a privilege, right? They're both such exciting, wonderful places. And I don't know why they saw a kind of plucky 20-year-old who was excited about social justice as somebody that might be a good fit for them, but they did. And I really agonized over that choice. It felt really sliding doors to me. Do I go to the Attorney General's Department? Maybe I get to become an international lawyer. Maybe I get to do this work that I've been so excited about at university. But if I go back to what I wanted to be, I wanted to be a correspondent living in different countries, learning about different places and writing about it. Well, a life of diplomacy kind of made sense from that perspective. I really over-agonized about that choice. And at every kind of, sliding doors moment, I've done the same thing. I'm that kind of person, I think. But I did choose to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and then work there in the legal areas, actually. So initially I worked on our Papua New Guinea missions and on some of the aid and governance projects that we were there. I then went into sanctions and transnational crime, where I was, one of the officers that was learning about and implementing Australia's sanctions regime. And so still very kind of a strong legal focus, but in a role that was a foreign policy role. I was then lucky enough to be sent to Australia's post in Honiara as a part of the regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands. And even then, despite not having been hired as a lawyer, I was put in charge of the law and justice pillar of the regional assistance mission. And so I was working there deeply with the courts and with the jails on how to improve the way in which their justice system was operating after Solomon Islands had been rebuilt from a pretty difficult place. These were all incredible opportunities that I, feel so lucky to have had, but also so lucky to have had that legal training, I think, to get me through those positions and really understand how important it was, but also how these different institutions should be functioning and could be functioning, and how important it was to the broader society for those institutions to function. After Honiara, I was sent to Beijing. And again, this is a job that technically shouldn't have had really anything to do with my legal background, but it was a human rights portfolio. And so suddenly I was, going to Chinese courtrooms and to hear cases to observe cases that were being held against dissidents and human rights defenders in China. And I had the, again, absolute privilege of being exposed to another country's legal system, the people that were fighting to improve it, the people that were pushing back, and really became immersed in a world of Chinese law reform where you had, I don't want to draw a binary, but you had a very significant group of individuals who saw legal reform as one of the ways for China's future to be better for many people. And then a number of senior officials and politicians who saw law reform and governance and the rule of law as a way to exercise control in particular areas. And so again, understanding the way these different systems worked and the way in which different people were benefiting and learning and enfranchised and disenfranchised by the law was such an important part of that job. When I came back from Beijing, I worked on the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper and Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy. And I went from there here to the Lowy Institute, where I work on public opinion. I run our annual polls, our surveys, and in that again, it's not strictly about the law, but the fact that I am very focused on what the evidence tells us, what the data says, not really trying to buy into the various ideologies and disputes over the foreign policy world that we live in, but really what do we know and what can we build as an argument with that information. I really feel like that skill set, as well as that, passion for what people think and how they work and how they operate in a democracy and in a social justice sense. It's been kind of a running theme through this career, even if, it might not be obvious from the outside.
Yeah. What a fabulous career and so many marvelous opportunities. And now, if you look at the state of the world that we're in at the moment, your experience is exactly right. It's exactly in the most important and sort of consequential areas. Now, I see that you've actually been quite modest in terms of your path and the opportunities that you've had. But I was wondering, is there anything that sort of sticks in your mind as sort of a particular inspiration? Some event or a person or something you encountered which sort of really inspired you, and whether your motivations have sort of changed over time. I know you wanted to be a journalist, and that sort of led you off to a number of decisions, but is there anything that in that area in terms of your motivations and your inspirations that you can point to?
There's probably two things that I think mean the most, I suppose I would say, and they might both be a little bit unexpected. The first, I would say, inspiration is, even though I talked about, justice and injustice, I think the idea of a legal system as a level playing field, or at least as that being the aspiration, even if it's not always achieved, I think that meant a lot to me and to my family as migrants in this country. And my parents, I think, really grew up with this sense that we had to behave better than everybody else, and we had to hold ourselves to a higher standard to ensure that we were accepted in a country that was, becoming much more multicultural and diverse and tolerant. But of course, in the 80s and 90s, it was, a different place to what it is today, and there's still a lot of work to do. It really inspired me to see that through education and through my legal education in particular, it felt like a great equalizer in our lives. It felt like this was a place where I could work very hard, and it didn't actually matter what background I was or where I came from or even what gender I was, all of these things. None of that seemed that important. And I think, I have these strong memories of when it had been a very long time before we'd had a woman on the High Court of Australia, and one and then two and then three and then four were appointed kind of while I was at law school and over that 10-year period. And I think all of that together came to make me feel as though this pathway was one where I could have those opportunities, and my background, didn't matter. And I think that was really special to me. That's one thing I would point to. But one of the biggest inspirations for the work that I've done, I feel like a lot of my career opportunities have almost been accidents. I mentioned I applied to government because there was a financial crisis. I was sent to China because I was good at languages, not because it was my background, but because I'd grown up in a very multilingual family. And that meant when the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade tests you for your language aptitudes, I did very well. And they said, okay, well, we'll teach you Mandarin, and that's how I ended up in China, not for any other reason. And so all of those accidents, like you said, maybe that's one way of looking at it. But I got to Beijing and suddenly I was immersed in this world of civil society and human rights defenders and non-government organizations and these people who had this idea of how they could improve their country and improve it during the law. They inspired me every day. Can I tell you, like, more than half of those human rights defenders, so many of them, if they had wanted to leave, if they had wanted to go to the United States or to Germany or to UK on refugee pathways that were made quite easy by those countries, they had that opportunity and they chose not to do it. They wanted to stay and they wanted to improve their country and they wanted to do it using the law. There's one lawyer in particular that I won't mention by name, but she and I spent quite a lot of time together. And she was actually a corporate lawyer who was a victim of, I guess, police brutality, and then was charged with having attacked a police officer when this had just happened to her as a corporate lawyer. That episode, she would say it radicalized her, but it really refocused what she was using the law for. And the way she kind of took her corporate and business background as a lawyer and refocused it on achieving law reform in so many areas that maybe we don't hear about so much today because there are so many other stories that are very much worth our time. But, there were significant movements in law reform happening when I was in China. She was inspirational. Everybody I met there was inspirational. And I think that my future career hopefully will be one that focuses on, human rights law in Asia and the ways in which those people are working so hard and what we can do to draw light to their efforts.
Yeah. Yes, certainly there's so many inspiring and brave people, people whose courage actually is almost beyond words, and commitment is beyond words. So I'm so glad that you raised that point. Tell me, Natasha, throughout your career, what have you learned, do you think, and what advice might you have, for people who are now in the process of, trying to build their own Asian legal career in their own way? Do you have any words of comfort, advice, encouragement?
I will say, the first thing I have to say is you don't have to have it all worked out. You don't need to know, every moment that I've talked about as being, this big decision point, I've said I agonized over it. I'm sure all of the students will also agonize over these decisions and over these, opportunities and missed opportunities and challenges. That is human and normal, but you don't need to know, there's probably not been a day in the last kind of 15 years where I've been like, this is exactly where I'm going and this is exactly what I want to be doing. Instead, I've been open to the opportunities, enthusiastic about, change as much as that is possible. And the key, I would say, I keep talking about accidents and luck and these sorts of things in my life. I have no doubt that a lot of that is why I get to do the things that I love. But I also would say that I've always been really committed to kind of just old-fashioned hard work. I think that in my line of work, there are a lot of people who do incredible work and talk a lot about that work, and they kind of generate more attention by virtue of self-promotion, and that is absolutely one path. But if that's not who you are and it's not who I am, it's not the only path. And the thing that has always meant great opportunities have come to me is I'm known to be reliable and hardworking and that I get things done, and I'm not necessarily going to advertise that too much, although obviously I'm doing it here and that's a little bit strange and awkward. But I really do think that when people are like, oh, we've got this big job and we need like somebody who can deliver, they're likely to think of me and lots of other people, of course. But that has ended up being my strength, being productive and reliable rather than a lot of the other things that you might see in this field. So I suppose that's a very convoluted way of saying there's no single path. You don't need to know where you're going, but also you don't need to. It's great to have mentors. It's great to have people to look up to, but you don't need to emulate any particular style or any particular way of being in the world. If you work hard and do a good job at your way of being, I think that can also lead you in a particular way, and be open to unexpected things is, the other thing I would say. It's I sat on, 100 kind of careers panels where somebody always says, do what you love and you'll be fine. And I always feel like saying, in this economy, you know, it's so important to do things that you're passionate about and that you care about. But I, you know, have always thought about that in a fairly practical way as well. You know, how can I make sure that I'm spending my days doing things that I'm good at and that I'm interested in, but that I feel good about? And for me, that's been going down the more public sector, public contributions, and like less of a private sector, but that's just what's worked for me. It might be different for other people. But yeah, I would encourage people to think about where in their Venn diagram of things they're interested in, things they're good at, things they're passionate about, and things that actually kind of are viable career paths. Where do you find the spot in between all of those things and try to balance that?
Yeah. No, that's fabulous, and I think it's so important. You know, your message is so important. That is, be true to yourself and act in good faith. These are really important principles. I think that means that you don't wake up one day and regret, you know, what you might have done. But the other thing that I didn't mention before, which is very important, and I think, you know, warrants mention, is that being multilingual, bilingual, multilingual, making the effort to learn another language actually helps you to engage sort of more fully and to understand sort of other cultures and other ways of thinking in ways, and certainly I think that, you know, your capacity with languages has demonstrated, firstly, that it's really good for your career, but also that it's just great to do that.
You're absolutely right. I think that it is essential, and kind of in this day and age where you have incredible AI, incredible Google Translate, you can see how people would downplay the value of learning other languages. But it's not, you know, it's just those apps are incredible and they're great resources, but they're not going to be the same as the kind of immersive cultural experience you can have to really understand another culture and other people's. And I mean, you're never going to get to fully understand anything in that way, but you suddenly get a lot closer if you're able to speak their language. I do worry that we don't invest enough in those language capabilities, and I again feel very lucky to have had those opportunities. But it is also, you know, another reason, just to, you know, get on one of my favorite soapboxes, it's another reason to really invest in a diverse workforce where you do have, you know, we have a country that is full of people who can speak other languages, that have parents or themselves were born in other countries, and that is a gift, and we need to harness that gift in our foreign policy, in our legal system, in, you know, all of the different areas that I think are just strengthened by having that diversity at all levels in all institutions.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Look, thank you so much for talking to us and to sharing your story and your insights and your challenges. It's really uplifting to listen to you. And can we just wish you all the best in your new position when you take it up as a foreign policy advisor in the Foreign Minister's Office. I'm so glad that you will have that opportunity to continue your fabulous work. So, Natasha, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And can I just also commend all of the work you and the Asian Law Centre do to bring people together across jurisdictions and across different issues, and really, you know, I think shed light on all of the different legal issues that are shared across borders and that are distinct across borders. I think it's incredible work, and I've been really thrilled to be a part of it for the last 2 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.